So guys, welcome to the first research webinar hosted by SCORI, MSAI India. SCORI is an unit of MSAI, which is Medical Students Association of India, one of the biggest student bodies, medical student bodies of India. The parent body of MSAI is IFMSA, which is International Federation of Medical Students Association. Today, this webinar is brought to you, as I said, by SCORI, MSAI. The name of this webinar is Research Presentation and Comprehension. And so today we'll be basically dealing with introduction to research as well as paper presentation. Research is something that is not covered entirely in the medical curriculum. So this webinar will teach you guys and will guide you to conduct your own research in at an undergraduate level in your own medical colleges. So that's the main objective of this webinar. Now, guys, before we start with the webinar, I want to introduce some pointers over here. So first of all, I'll begin with introducing myself. I am Jay, National Officer of SCORI India. And now, so there are certain pointers that we all need to be careful for so that the webinar can proceed in a smooth way. First of all, I request all of you to please keep your microphones turned off at all the times. If you guys have any queries, we certainly have a chat box in the Zoom call that you can type your queries in. Also, this webinar is right now being live broadcasted on YouTube. So for all of those who are watching it on YouTube, I request you all to please, you can even type your queries on the YouTube chat section as well. So now, beginning with the agenda, I request my colleague Shiva to please take over the baton and he'll be presenting to you the agenda for today's webinar. Thank you so much and have a great webinar.
Thank you, Jay. I again welcome you all to the webinar. I am Shiv Sandesh, National Officer on Research Exchange Outgoings for the term of MSAI, Medical Students Association of India. So I welcome you all to this webinar and thank you for coming. So before we begin the webinar, so as Jay mentioned, this is going to briefly explain you about research and research methodology and motivate you for the same, and also include a few points on paper presentations. So yeah, let's begin with some keynote speakers who will be talking about topics related to research, and then we'll have a floor open for questions, and then let's move on to paper presentations. We have three amazing students with beautiful researches that they have conducted in their UG life. They will be presenting it with us, and then let's go to questions, and we'll be wrapping up the webinar after that. So let's begin with our keynote speaker. Our first keynote speaker is Purva Prabha Patil. I'm sorry. She is the president of our MSAI, Medical Students Association of India, and she'll be talking about importance of undergraduate medical research. Purva.
So can we just wait a few seconds until my PPT loads? Okay, so is my screen visible to everybody? Maybe I can get a few
Yes, Purva.
yeses in the chat box. Perfect. So I'm going to start with just asking around the room what comes to mind when you hear the word researcher? You can just add it to the chat. Anybody, any adjectives that you have? We got discovery, analysis, looking for new information, poking and prying, innovation, curiosity. That's quite relevant. All of these are quite relevant. And what adjectives do you think could connect to this? Like, if you think of somebody as a researcher, what do you think they are? Are they too old? Or are they very nerdy? Or in terms of such adjectives, what would come to your mind? Textbook authors, nerd, okay, curious, cool people. Wow, that's anybody with passion, good observers. That's quite a mix of responses we're getting. And a lot of them hold true in a lot of different ways. You have to be very curious about things happening around you, because technically research is answering questions that pretty much exist in your surroundings and looking at things through a different lens. And no, you do not need to be a nerd to be a researcher. You can be just as, you can be a sports player, you can have different hobbies, and at the same time, you can also be a hardcore researcher. So moving on, I'm going to.
Sorry, Puva, if you can just give me 1 minute, I can disable the annotation.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't bother me too much. So either way, it's fine. Now, do I need to be ultra smart to do research work? Is it a yes or a no from most people? Okay, we have quite a few no's and we have a couple of yeses as well. And in most places, there are no right or wrong answers, but here there is. And the right answer is you don't need to be anywhere close to ultra smart. And just not demeaning anybody's smartness, you're all in medical school, and you're all in the care field, you're very smart, but don't necessarily need ultra smartness in research. You could be a medical student. I saw a very important question raised in the chat box a couple of minutes back, as to when does somebody start research? What's too early? What's too late? I started research in the first year of my med school. So there's no too early when it comes to research, and it just depends on what interests you and if you're asking yourself the right questions. So that you can start, it doesn't matter if you're in your final year or if you're an intern, you're not late. There's no necessary early or late. You can start research whenever you want. Now, moving further to, as an undergrad, why does research even matter? Ashmeet has talked a lot about, is given a brief about what research is, how do we do it? But it boils down to why is research necessary? Like, why are we talking about this? Why do we have to do this? It's not in our curriculum, so why do we care? And there's not one, but multiple answers to it. And my answers are divided in two different ways. The first is, how does it help you professionally? And the second is, how does it help you interpersonally? And professionally, it helps you understand what the whole process is about. A lot of researchers require you to also do some lab work, so you learn a lot of different techniques. Like for me, I learned how to do ELISA and just all steps involved in the process, which was very beneficial for me to understand how these tests are performed, what happens in the biochem lab. So that I wouldn't say that necessarily answers everybody's interests, but then it does help you explore new things that otherwise you in your curriculum wouldn't. Apart from that, research is an actual career path. So if at any point you feel like clinics are not for you, and I know there are quite a few people that feel that way, research is always something that you can look into. It opens up job opportunities regardless of whether you're in a clinical field or whether you're in paraclinical fields, whether or not you're doing anything within core healthcare branches. Research is something that will more or less fit into any profession or anything you're doing. For example, if you practice and go to teaching, try and be a professor, research will come in handy there. A lot of job opportunities have now also started to offer remuneration based on how many research projects you have or how many publications you have. So that is definitely stepping up big time professionally. Apart from that, getting a leg up on life exams. I know that a lot many people are very interested in getting in trying to write USMLE or PLAB, and all of this really comes when when you're doing something like that. It also helps in building connections within the scientific community with professors or with scientists within the country or even outside of India. For those of you who might be wondering, there are SCORI hosts research exchanges internationally, and a lot of Indian students go out in different countries and different continents to learn research and to assist other professors and other scientists on research projects in different countries outside of India. So building connections nationally and internationally, developing skills in the interpretation of results. For example, something that I think a lot of people will connect with COVID. There are so many researches happening around COVID, what is working, what's not working, and one medical students, professionals, people expect you to know what's happening. People expect you to understand interpretations of different studies. So one way research helps you is to really know what these numbers are, what are people talking about, what is the effectivity of these vaccines, or how are diseases spreading, and all of these questions. So it's not only doing your own research, but also understanding what researchers across the world are interpreted as, or what are they saying. Apart from that, interpersonally, it helps you learn how to work independently while also collaborating with other people or on your own research, independent research projects. Having tolerance, which not only helps you within your academic curriculum, but even outside of academics and studies and research as an individual. Understanding how knowledge is constructed. Personally, for me, that's helped me legitimize information that I read on a daily basis. It's flooded with information, and a lot of that is not necessarily true. So you can it helps you figure out all of these things on a daily basis. By, you can probably do 2 or 3 research projects, and you will feel the difference in the way you're interpreting data and things. Then knowledge and in the world, which if not 100% people consider a priority, I'm sure at least 10% like me do. And it raises your self-confidence when you're presenting your research, when you're talking to people outside of medicine about your research, when you're explaining research, or when you're defending your findings. It does help you develop your confidence greatly. And lastly, also to understand the assertions that require a lot of scientific evidence, scientific data, and a lot of it has a lot of loopholes which a normal person would not be able to see. But if you have had experience in research, you know that that's not going to be a problem for you. So with that, that's just a very, very, very short run through of what are the benefits of doing research and how it's helped me as a person. And apart from that, if you have any questions specifically around how you can do research projects, or how can you apply for research exchange, or if you just want to check on what's the beautiful work that SCORI India is doing, you can reach out to scori@msindia.org. But if there are any specific questions directed to me, or if you want to learn about my experience in research, please feel free to write to president@msindia.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Purva. That was a very elaborate presentation. In a given speaker for the day is Ashmeet Sachdev. She is our ex-National Officer of Research Exchange for the year 2018-19, and also she is a part of SCORI IT. She was SCORI Regional Assist for Asia Pacific of IFMSA, and she'll be talking about Research 101, how to get started, and she'll be giving you tips and tricks on how to conduct a research. Ashmeet, you can take over.
Can you just confirm with me if I'm visible and audible?
Yes, Ashmeet, you're visible and you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So the topic that we're dealing with today is basically Research 101 and how to get started. So firstly, I just want to inform that I am not a professional. I don't know like everything about research. I'm just a student, like hopefully you are, who was a little bit enthusiastic about it, who always found the idea really daunting. I didn't understand half the terms. I didn't know how to get started. So the point of this 7-minute presentation is for you to just get an idea on how to begin. Hopefully, by connecting with my experience or paying attention to what I have to say, you feel a little bit inspired and you just get a head start on how to begin. So the first thing we're going to be dealing with is how to pick a research topic. Now, this is one of the questions that people normally tend to get stuck on because you don't know how to begin. And the important thing to keep in mind is that there are actually not as many options as you think there would be. Because when you realize that you're an undergraduate and when you realize there's a lot of factors and that you have to be realistic about, you will realize that there are actually not way too many options. So the whole point of this is to just get started. Also, like when we started research, we all want to have something groundbreaking and we all want to like discover something that hasn't been discovered. And that's how at least I perceived research in the beginning. But it's important to keep in mind that research is a building process. So there is no point if I do a groundbreaking research in suppose my university, but there is nobody else who's confirming it with other sections of the society to make sure that it's actually significant. So the whole point of research is to actually build upon something. So even if your idea is not original, it does not matter. Okay, so a few steps on how to actually go about picking a research topic. The first thing to keep in mind is identify area of passion. So now it's really important to be passionate about what you need to do because it is difficult to stay motivated. There will be a lot of barriers that you will face. So it is very difficult to stay motivated throughout the process. So it's really important that whatever field it may be, if you're passionate about biochemistry, if you're passionate about psychiatry, it's really important to care about how your research is going and the implication if it's going to make a difference in the world. So it's really important to be passionate about it. So the first step, okay, I decide that I am passionate about, for example, psychiatry. Then I will explore. Now, how to explore? To be very honest, your best friend is Google Scholar. All you need to do is go to Google Scholar, type psychiatry researches, or maybe if you're curious about, how much stress medical students are under, how much stress people, of any of the country is supposed under. If it's different from India, is India more stress, less stress? Is Mumbai more stress, less stress? The whole key is to just start. So the first thing you would explore. Like I said, Google Scholar is your best friend. That should be the place that you would just get started. Secondly, there's also obviously medical journals that if you have a well-resourced library, you could find it in that, and also textbooks. Now, mind that everything I am saying is very general. These are all the things that one student is telling to the other. This is in no way the best and the most foolproof way you can go about it. This is something that I always find helpful. I found it helpful with my first research and all the projects that I took after that. So, mind you, it's just a very something that works for me. Okay, so you explored it. Now you realize that, okay, all of this research has been done and you have a little bit of idea that, okay, I'm finding stress-related research is very interesting. I'm finding researches related to diabetes very interesting. Once you've explored and you have a little idea on what researches are being done, then you would discuss. Now, this is actually a very ignored and a very important step because a lot of times when you discuss with your peers or you're discussing it with your if you already have a mentor or with your colleague or any professor that you really connect with or you feel you can talk to, this will really help make your idea realistic. It will give you a reality check if you're going in the right direction. So a discussion with peers and colleagues is highly important. So after doing this, it may sound vague at this moment, but if you really go about this passionately and do each of the steps, by step 3, you will be very clear on what your research is and what you're supposed to do. At least you will be oriented to a particular direction and you will know what exactly you want to do. The next step that you have to keep in mind that your research has to cater to a gap in knowledge. Now, you don't have to do an original research, but there's no point of doing a research that like the same thing has been done. So suppose someone has already studied about maybe a research about diabetes in Mumbai. So maybe I can do a similar research in Delhi and see that, okay, is it similar? Is it different? If it's different, why is it different? Or if someone is researched about study of diabetes in maybe above 60-year-olds, I can see see that, okay, maybe 40 to 60-year-olds isn't covered and I can do it on that. So there has to be a gap in knowledge that you are fulfilling, even if it's not an original idea. The next thing is feasibility. Now, I may want to research about, pharmacological action of some drug on rats, but do I have those facilities? Can it be done? Or maybe I want to study about, do a study about schizophrenia, but do I have like a lot of schizophrenic patients in my hospital that will increase the sample size and help me conduct a significant research? So when you tend to bring feasibility into the subject, you will realize that a lot of options are already cut down. Thirdly, it has to be a measurable outcome. That means that you have to be able to come to a particular result. Okay, moving on. How do you define it? Now, suppose you decided, okay, I want to study about stress in medical students. How do you define exactly what you want to study? A very general way of elimination is keeping these things in mind. That is who, what, where, and when. So, for example, if you're studying a very general example, perceived stress among medical students of Mumbai during the COVID-19 outbreak. So perceived stress is your what, among medical students is your who, of Mumbai is where, and during the COVID-19 outbreak is when. Now, when may or may not be applicable in certain situations. You may not need to include when in your title. For instance, if I'm not talking about the COVID-19 outbreak and I'm talking about perceived stress among medical students of Mumbai in 2013, it may not be necessary to include 2013 in that case. Since COVID-19 outbreak is a landmark, in that case, you would include it. So remember, who, what, where is very important, but when is depending on what topic you're dealing with. So now, this is a very basic of writing a research proposal. The objective of this is to not help you write a research proposal, but to just help you get an idea of what are the factors you need to consider while thinking of writing a research proposal. So basic of a research abstract. So this is a mnemonic that I made that helped me. So this is what one loves about medical research. This would stand for title, which we've already dealt with. What exactly are you studying? Is would be an introduction in which you would talk about what is the definition of each of the element you're considering, or you would talk about what all like what is the stance today? What do we believe about this topic today? Third is what. That is, what are you researching? In which it would basically be your hypothesis that I am trying to prove that this causes this, or obesity is directly linked to diabetes mellitus. So this would be your what? This would be your hypothesis. Then it would be, then one is your objective. Now, objective in this scenario means your implication. What are you trying to achieve by this? So in this, suppose if I am doing a research about stress in medical students, I'm trying to achieve work on mental health of medical students to make sure this topic is realized, to make sure certain changes are made in maybe our curriculum or maybe the environment to reduce that stress. So that is my implication. Then we have literature review, which is you have to go through all the current studies that I've done, so you know where you are at and what is the stance of the topic in today's world, how much has been researched about it. About is just I've written it in black purposely to just remind you that we're talking about an abstract here. Methodology is what design you're using, if it's cross-sectional or if it's retrospective. What are you exactly? How are you going to approach it? Are you using a questionnaire? Are you using a predetermined scale? Are you using any drug intervention? And last is references. This is highly important, that any research you use is well referenced and everybody knows what your sources. So if they want to research further, they can go into those sources. So now these are commonly asked questions. I'm not sure if we have time to discuss them right now. So for now, I will skip them. But if you have any of these questions, then you can always address these in the chat box and we will deal with these later. So for now, I don't know if we have time to discuss it in the presentation. Thank you. And if you have any further questions, I realize that I've rushed through just a little bit. It's just the whole point is to give you an orientation in 7 minutes. But if you have any further questions, feel free to, we'll discuss it. They've allotted time for the questions, so we will discuss it then. Okay, thank you. And I hope this was helpful. And I will now mute myself. So Jai and Shiva, you can take over.
Thank you so much, Ashwin. That was very informative PPT within just 7 minutes, and you've covered. So Ritika will be talking about importance of baseline assessment, and she is our Vice President for Activities and in MSAI. So before I
Hello everyone, can you all see me?
yes, Ritika, we can see you.
Okay, can you share the slides?
Yeah.
Hello everyone, I'm Ritika and I'm the Vice President for Activities for this term for MSCI, and I'll be talking to you about baseline assessment. So can I know what you guys think about baseline assessment? Like what comes to your mind when you hear this word? Okay, nothing. Okay, yeah. So most of y'all are, that's right. So it's basically the very basic step and the groundwork that is related to this. So whenever you plan on having a research, so there is basically something that should be ready that you need to work upon. So what happens is that all researchers, you guys aim to publish it. But if you do a baseline assessment, it's also about how this baseline can help you make interventions. So the interventions could be, policy drafts, policy statements, or it can be like launching an activity in order to like work on your research that you've done. So a very basic example, somewhere all of us have been or will be in our medical curriculum, is in PSM, the way we go to take, surveys like school surveys, family surveys. So these are basically baseline assessments. Can you go to the next slide? So what exactly is the baseline assessment? It is basically providing us with some information about the situation that our campaign or your research aims to change. So the very reason why we need a baseline assessment is that you can refer to research articles, but that research might be valid in suppose USA, but you're doing basic research, which is at your college level. So it will not make sense if you are publishing the data or you are using that problem statement of USA as a country to come to an intervention at your college level. So a baseline assessment is basically a survey that you will be doing in your college in order to make an intervention. And that is exactly what a baseline assessment means. So it is basically a reference point, a skeleton, like someone said, on which you'll be working forward in your research that you aim on doing. Okay, next slide. So this is basically a roadmap in the sense, what are you exactly supposed to do? So the very step one is a baseline assessment, which would be conducted before your campaign or before you publish your research. Then would be your the campaign forming part. Suppose once I do a survey for a particular family and I come to a particular conclusion that for this village, the problem is sanitation and I want to do a campaign on it, or I want to publish a research article on this. So it's after the survey that I will further build up on, what would my intervention be. And the final step would be monitoring and evaluation of if your intervention helped. Yeah, so that is basically how you're supposed to go about it. Can I go to the next slide? So data collection, in the sense, how are you supposed to go about this? So the type of data that you will be including in the baseline, it depends on the goal that you have. So suppose if you have the topic for your research that you decide is that you would want to work on mental health. So suppose depression, anxiety, and stress in medical students. So this is what you want to work upon. So what would your baseline assessment be? Who is the survey? Like, who are you going to have the survey for? So you're going to have the survey for medical students. You're going to have research articles for those students. So this is what it means. And if you plan on doing an intervention after the baseline assessment, then you need to make sure that after the intervention, the target population that you approach, you would be approaching the same target audience. Next slide. So it is really important for you to have a good source of information. Another thing about baseline assessment is you cannot just start out of nowhere, though it is a very basic and it is something that you have to, it is a very skeleton. However, if there is a problem statement that you do decide to work on, you need to make sure that you do refer to articles that are present online, like Ashmeet mentioned. You have to go through those portals and see what are the statistics that are already there, and how will your baseline assessment and how will your survey be in accordance to that. So you have to refer to official statistics and journals and survey results for the particular topic that you have gone through before. Next slide. Okay, so this is pretty much about baseline assessment. I know this can be a very new word to all of you all, but somewhere in your life, you all have done this. However, we didn't know the official terminology of this, and I hope it's pretty clear. So before you even start with a research, this is the very first and basic step that you would be doing. We always follow the norms of research that, seeing a senior or seeing someone that you're supposed to just give those research forms to everyone and ask people to fill it. But why are you filling this? This is the baseline assessment that you're doing. This is the data on which you would be like drafting your entire research on. And this is something that MSCI works on like daily basis for activities. There are many activities where we do our baseline assessment in order to know what is the actual problem, and so that we can do intervention. And till now in India, people really focus on publishing the research papers, but and somehow they stop after that. So I would really encourage everyone to like step into interventions and do campaigns in order to like make use of the research that they have done. Okay, talking about my experience, I started a research project in my third minor, which was on depression, anxiety, and stress in medical students. And I went on to present this in the bioethics, a bioethic unit seminar that was held in Amritsar. And the protocol that I followed is first you have to propose this idea to your tutor or someone you approach in your particular college, after which you have to get your proposals accepted by the ethics committee of your college if it is in place, after which you can further work on it with your tutor. And that's when your baseline assessment comes into picture, because you will be submitting, because you will be distributing the forms for responses, and then you will see, you do the entire survey and you will come up with conclusions about it and way forward with the research as Ashmeet had explained. And yeah, so that was my experience regarding the research presentations that I've done. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ritika. That was an eye-opener, because we all know how important baseline assessment is and we do it on daily basis, but we don't know what exactly to do and how exactly to. So we thank you for this beautiful presentation. And moving on. Next up, we have Arya Shah, who is our Regional Director for West in MSII. She'll be talking about ethical guidance in research. Just to mention that she was also the coordinator for UNESCO, MSII UNESCO Bioethics Unit last year. So she has a lot of experience in this field. And Arya.
Hi, Shiv. Thank you so much for that introduction. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Hi, everybody. So, when the excellent speakers before me were speaking, I saw so many questions about the ethics review committee. And yeah, can you present, please? Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes. So, ethical guidelines in research can be a polarizing topic for many. However, contrary to popular belief, it's not just limited to consent forms and saving cute animals, or a long drawn out process in front of an ethics review community. Can we move forward? Next slide, please. Yeah. So ethical guidelines help discipline the study. They promote the aims of research. They support the values that are important for the collaborative work, and they hold us accountable to the public. They also protect both the researcher and the participant. To better comprehend this, let's look at the origin of research ethics. Can we go to the next slide, please? So until 1947, research ethics weren't actually a thing. Um, so following Hitler's rise in power, a number of highly inhumane clinical researches were carried out in Germany, where the rights of the research participants were ignored to prioritize quote the needs of the nation unquote. After the end of the Second World War, at the war crime trials, there was one held for the 23 doctors involved in these human experiments. This led to the establishment of the Nuremberg Code. It's actually the most important document in the history of research ethics because it was the first time that an ethical code was established. Before that, the argument was that any person who is educated. However, as history has proved, that was not the case. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So we have come a long way since then, with most of the countries and organizations adopting their own ethical code. These usually cover general areas like honesty and integrity, which is don't make up or exaggerate data, methodology, tools, etc. And be sincere in your work with your co-researchers. Objectivity, which is avoiding bias, because in history we have seen that a lot of researchers, including ones we still quote today, showed a lot of racial or gender bias, which actually hurt us in the long term. Carefulness, pay attention to detail and keep proper records of everything, because a research does not is not just word of mouth or what the researcher says. You have to prove everything and you need records for that. Openness, which loosely translates to sharing is caring. If you have resources or knowledge, then share them with everybody. Respect for intellectual property, which is don't copy or plagiarize. That's pretty self-explanatory. Confidentiality, which could be snitches get stitches. Basically, you are bound to a code of conduct as a researcher, and confidentiality actually happens to be one that is very important because you are given so much sensitive data, especially when human subjects are involved, and you don't want to go around and share personal or sensitive data with other people for no reason. Responsible publication. Publish to advance your field and science, but not to help your career. Legality, which again, it's just don't do illegal stuff. And animal care. Be careful and respectful when working with animals and follow proper guidelines, because even if animals cannot talk to you or communicate their pain to you, it does not mean they don't feel it. And human subject protection. So the most basic way to talk about that would be get consent for everything. Try to minimize unnecessary testing and possible harm. And also keep in mind that if you're intentionally harming your subjects, then you might not be a scientist. But you could possibly be a serial killer. The ethics review committee is might seem like a huge and daunting prospect getting a certificate from them. But as Ritika said, a lot of colleges have their own ethics review committee, and the members of those are usually your teachers. So if you are confused as to uh, how to go about the certification, you should always try to approach any of your teachers and they will help you through it, especially because the types of researches we conduct at an undergraduate level aren't exactly something we're going to be experimenting on humans on, right? The role of the research ethics committee is not to research review, ethics review committee is not to shut down your research. It is to make sure that whatever data you're collecting, whatever research you're conducting, it's for the betterment of society and science, and not for and that you're not harming somebody else in the process of trying to help everybody else. So that's all I have for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask us in the chat. And this was a great session. Thank you so much, Corey and India. It was amazing to be a part of this.
Thank you so much, Arya. You not just mentioned about the ethical clearance, you also explained us about the history of ethical clearance and importance of ethics, something that even I was not aware of. So I hope this was very informative to all the attendees. And now let's go to let's take some questions. Our national team member Suhani Jain will take over. Suhani.
Hi everyone for attending this meeting, and it was really nice to see you all present here. We've got a couple of questions today, and we'll be happy to answer all of them. But due to the shortage of time, we've selected some common questions that we'll be addressing to the executive board members, and they'll be happy to cater to it. So the first question that's very common is how to find a tutor, and if there's no tutor in our college, can we ask for some other tutor?
Is it okay if I take over this question?
Yes, Rashmi,
Yes.
go ahead.
Okay, it's a great question. About how to find a tutor, it really depends, to be very honest, on your college. But it is really okay if you come from a college where research is not very big. I understand that experience. I've had a very similar experience. How to find a tutor? A good way, a very casual, I know it's a very casual reply, but a good way would be to start talking to your seniors about it if anybody's done a research, or just approach any faculty member who you feel like is approachable. If they can help you with it, then they may show you who else you can approach. To be very honest, for colleges who don't have a research board, it is all about trial and error. You may be, with a tutor who you feel is not great, but it is the whole concept of it is trial and error. As well, but if you do have a research board in your college, then I think it would be a very easy way to go about it. The whole concept of this is to get out there, start, talk, and try. That is the first step towards it. Until you do that, you cannot really, be by yourself and wonder this. If you can approach a tutor from another college, it really depends on the ethical committee guidelines of that college and your college. If you are working with a tutor of that, like a different college, will the ethical committee of that college allow you to do that? Will the ethical committee of your college allow you to do the research with your, maybe patients in your hospital? So it really depends on the ethical committee guidelines. I've tried to keep this really short. If there is follow-up questions, I'll try to answer it in the chat box.
Thank you so much, Ashmita. I guess that answers the question.
Okay, so the next question is, how do we get funds for conducting a research?
Suhani, can you please repeat the question? I guess there was some network issue.
Okay, I'll repeat it. The question was, how do you get funds for conducting your research?
Ritika, can you please take this question? I guess she's not there on the call.
I think Purva can answer this.
Yeah, Purva. She probably is not on the call as well. So I think that brings us to Ashmeet. Ashmeet, can you please answer this question as well?
Okay, about funds in your research, it really depends. If you have a research committee in your college, then they would have certain kind of allocation of funds, and if they may not give you funds directly, then you can probably join a bigger project that is already funded by your college. This is if your college has a proper research committee. If your college does not have a research committee, ICMR SPS is a great way, because I also did one of my projects with them, and they do offer you a fund. When I did it, I think it was 10,000, but I believe it's more now. But I would really say that if it's your first research, it should be something that ideally does not need funds. There are hundreds of things you can do out there with the help of questionnaires, with the help, where you are doing it yourself, which doesn't need any intervention. And for your first research, because you already need to, it takes you at least one research to understand the methodology completely. So as far as possible, try to keep your first research fundless, and then once you've understood the concept, you will know automatically who you can approach, how to get funds. Yeah, but as an orientation, I would say that try to keep your first research fund.
Thank you, Ashmit. If I may add, if I have any participants from Karnataka or students belonging to Rajiv Gandhi Institute of Health Sciences, I may also like to add that there are many universities that grant fund to undergraduate medical students for their research. For example, RGUHS has a UG medical grant. It gives you some amount of money to conduct your research. This is another way to get some funds. The next idea that I would like to share with you is, let's say if your research involves some community and it aids some community for in some issue. For example, if your research is about road traffic accidents or alcoholic syndromes, then you can always approach government institutes like uh, state traffic police department or central departments. For example, if you are from Karnataka, you can approach Karnataka Traffic Police Department or any department that your research is concerned with. Since I gave an example of road traffic accidents, research related to RTAs, I mentioned this, and they would be really helpful. I mean, they will be really eager to fund your research, and you can get a government grant as well. So this is also another option that I wanted to add. Suhani, I think we can take one more question.
Okay. Thank you, Shiv. That was really nice of you to have addressed it as well. So we have an ethics question right now, and many people are asking that they do not have an ethics committee in their college. So in case they want the ethics committee approval in this case for their project, what should they do?
I think Arya can take over.
I can't hear. I can't. Can you please repeat the question? I'm having internet issues.
Okay, sure. So there are many people who do not have ethics committee in their college, and in this case, if they want to have their research project approved by the IC, so what should they do?
Okay, so
Okay.
if you don't have an ethics review committee in your college, um, so it depends on, first of all, where you're trying to get your research published. If you're submitting it for a paper presentation, or if you are trying to submit it for an ICMR, STS, if you're going for and to help people, so you do have to get the approval from ICMR itself. Your tutor should be able to help you out. If you don't have an ethics review committee, you can go on the ICMR site and you can find all of the guidelines that we follow nationally, and you can always approach your tutor or the person who is the head of out a way to either get an, or they might help you with a college that has collaborations with your college's research unit. I'm sorry, does that make sense? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
I'm
I think there are some technical difficulties with Arya.
I think Arya's voice was not clear.
Yeah.
To summarize what she said, since Arya won't be able to I think there's some internet issue, but I like to summarize what she said. So what she meant is that it depends on what is the purpose that you are doing this research. I mean, if you are doing this research for an ICMR grant, then you can always apply to ICMR for ethical clearance. They will be happy to do it. Or at the least, there will be institutes which will be in collaboration with your hospital or your colleges for ethical clearance. and you can get your ethical clearance done there. Or at max, if you can approach the government college of that city. So for example, like state government owned medical college nearby, and they have their ethical clearance twice every year, and you can go and apply there in case your college does not have an ethical committee. I think this is what Arya meant. Let's go on. Okay, guys. So as time doesn't permit, we can only take 4 questions as of now, but we'll open floor for questions again after the presenters have finished. So now let's go to paper presentation. I think our next national team member, who is our PRC assistant Anusha, can take over. Anusha?
Sorry, I think there was something wrong with my mic. Yeah. So thank you so much, Shiv. Like as all of you know, we had opened applications out for the research presenting this for this event. And now coming to our presenters, the first presenter is Lavanya Jayakumar, who's from Sri Ramachandra Institute of Higher Education and Research in Chennai. And she's got her research published as well at the International Journal of Innovative Science and Research Technology. And if when you read her summary or a little bit of her introduction, you may think it's an extremely complicated research and it's something that a lot of us won't be able to do. But like Purva rightly said, you don't need to be ultra smart. So she explains it in a very nice manner. So I hope you guys enjoy her presentation. Over to you, Lavanya.
Hey, can you guys see my presentation?
Yes, Lavanya.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Lavanya Jayakumar from Sri Ramachandra Medical College. And I'm a second year student, and this research was basically conducted in first year, and I published it by the end of first year. It falls under the departments of anatomy and radiology. And also I was a local officer of research exchange for 2 terms, 1819 and 1920 for my college. To start off with, Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder that affects the motor system. One of the major setbacks of Parkinson's is that when the person comes into the clinic with classical symptoms of Parkinson's, it's pretty late. They've progressed into the disease. So what we're trying to do is find an early diagnosis, because Parkinson's symptoms, they overlap with the symptoms of other degenerative disorders as well, which makes it more difficult to diagnose it. And we saw iron as a biomarker of Parkinson's. So as we've all learned in neuroanatomy, iron accumulates normally in the substantia nigra. But not many of us know that it's not just the substantia nigra. There are other regions in the brain as well. Just a minute. There are other regions in the brain as well, which accumulates iron. And what happens is our basic concept was to analyze the iron accumulation and record it using magnetic susceptibility imaging. So magnetic susceptibility imaging can be picked up by magnetic resonance imaging, which brings us to our research. Now, what happens is in neurodegenerative disorders, the oxidative stress and cellular damage results in extra iron deposition. Iron deposition increases with increasing age in normal healthy patients as well. So what basically happens is when you take a 5-year-old healthy person's brain and a 70-year-old healthy person's brain, the 70-year-old person's brain will have way more iron than the 5-year-old brain. Coming to Parkinson's, because the oxidative stress leads to extra iron deposition, there will be way more iron in these brains. And that brings us to the project. Just a minute. Okay, that brings us to our project, that is quantitative assessment of iron accumulation. So basically my objectives was to evaluate, to measure the volume of iron and to compare this data with the normal scale. The methodology, it was a retrospective comparative study. So basically what this means is that my job was to analyze the scans that have already been in the database of the radiology department. And these scans that I would have analyzed about 200 scans, I guess. And the scans which were needed for my paper, the inclusion criteria were those with the MAC2 sequencing, and we excluded the scans which were having brain tumors, hematomas, etc., because it's difficult to analyze the iron in these regions, right? Study size. The study group consists of 45 patients of the age group of 45 to 85 years diagnosed with Parkinson's. And we had 54 non-Parkinson's patients. So these are the patients who walked into the clinic with symptoms like a headache or giddiness, anything but Parkinson's. And out of these 54 people, we chose 43 people as the control group. This is basically because when you, as a thumb rule, when you have a study group and a control group, the control group should have age and gender matched, should be age and gender matched with the study group. That is why out of 54 people, only 43 people were chosen as a control group. Coming to the study parameters and methods, it'll be better when I show you pictures, but basically what happened was, I told you, I was trying to assess the volume of iron, and that was using the basic formula, half of all the 3 dimensions, right? Now, there are different regions in the brain where, iron accumulates. We only know about the, substantia nigra, but my paper focused on the lentiform nucleus, dentaceous nucleus, the arrows point to them. The substantia nigra, and right next to the substantia nigra is the red nucleus. Like I told you, when I talk about volume, it's half of length, breadth, and height. So this diameter, the longest diameter will be the length, the next one will be the breadth, and the height is basically in MRI, each and every slice is 2.5 millimeter. So when you calculate the number of slices, you get the height of the nuclei, right? And what happened was, I told you there were 54 patients in the non-Parkinson's group. Out of these 54 patients, we created a control scale. And the control scale was compared to that of the normal Parkinson's group. Now, like I told you in the beginning, when you compare, this is clear that shows iron deposition increases with increasing age. When you see a 9-year-old patient, you can literally see very less iron deposition. 40-year-old has decent amount of iron deposition, and 73-year-old has, and these are all the same cross sections of the brain, the same cross section. And 70-year-old, you can see the red nucleus is pretty intense. Coming to Parkinson's patients, the substantia nigra and red nuclei are really, really dark, which indicates that is way more iron deposition in Parkinson's disease. And these are the observations. This was volume of iron. And like I told you, the red line over here indicates the control scale. And when you, at the backdrop, you can see that each and every nucleus in the Parkinson's patient has way more iron than the control scale, right? And I told you the 54 patient data that was summarized into this graph. That is, iron deposition increases with increasing age. These are all healthy people, non-Parkinson's patients. And in normal brains itself, iron deposition increases with increasing age. Now, conclusion was that basically, although Parkinson's is the second most common disease, only 4% of people are diagnosed before the age of 50. And so we wanted to make, we believe that, analyzing iron concentration distribution among the different nuclei in the brain can help in its early diagnosis and better treatment. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you again. Please feel free to ask me any queries.
Thank you so much, Lavanya, for enlightening us with that presentation. And in case all of you were listening, she's a second-year student and she's gone through 200 scans. So I think that's a lot of motivation for the rest of us to take up research and follow in her footsteps. Coming to the next person, she's a 4th-year student, Meghna Chaudhary, and her topic for today is brain drain or brain train. And she's from she's from Dr. Vittal Rao Vikhe Patil Foundation Medical College in Ahmednagar, and her study was recently approved by ICMR. So, Meghna, are you ready?
Yeah, I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, 1 second. Good evening, everyone. I'm Meghna Chaudhary, and my topic for the research presentation is brain drain or brain train, evaluation of impact of playing video games on the cognition of adolescents. Here we go. Live wiring. Therein lies the secret of the adaptability of human being. Our experiences, which form the essence of our lives, from the activities we indulge in to the thoughts and beliefs we hold, constantly rewire and relive the mind of this experiment is usually incomplete at birth in comparison to our fellow animals. Instead, gene acts as a blueprint for the formation of synaptic connections, while the environment fine-tunes these links. Gene can be said as the gun and environment with the trigger. Now, with adolescence being a period of significant cognitive changes, it is imperative to study the effect that experiences, or the lack thereof, has on the intricacies of these neural networks of adolescent brains. Cognitive functions, as we know, a collection of abilities and methods involving decision-making, alertness, information processing, problem solving, and visual space. Video games are essentially indoor activities, but require focused attention. However, during outdoor activities are essential for growth development, video games do act as a hindrance to physical and psychosocial progress. They are largely blamed for promoting aggressive behavior and antisocial personality. Nonetheless, due to increasing interest, emerging bodies of research across the world have now revealed that video games could indeed mold and improve cognitive abilities of adolescents. However, limited research has been done on this on our Indian counterparts. Hence, my study aims to explore whether video games are truly, whether they really enhance the cognitive functions of adolescents, and with that, I'd like to help further research in this field of neuroscience. Are quantitatively compare gamers and non-gamers with respect to 6 cognitive functions, which are attention span, alertness, short-term working memory, executive functioning, visual scan speed, and interference inhibition. To quantitatively compare the effect of video games on the cognition of male and female gamers, and finally to determine the correlation between the genre preference and the cognition of gamers. Corresponding to my 3 objectives, I had my research hypothesis, which stated that playing video games has a significant effect on the cognitive functions of adolescents, that the effect of playing video games is significantly higher on gamers than females. The strategy genre of video games has a significant effect on the cognition of gamers. This was a cross-section study, and the size was 6 to 100. Out of the 150 were the test group of the gamers, and other 50 were the non-gamers or the control group. Now, since I had around 170 volunteers who wanted to be a part of this project, I was at a liberty to choose my participants and my subjects wisely. Hence, my male to female ratio conveniently came in 1:1. And also for the video game genre preference, I could make it 1:1. For my inclusion criteria, I had 15 to 19-year-old healthy adolescents with an IQ range between 80 to 119 who play video games on an audiovisual device for 15 to 20 hours per week on an average since 2 to 4 years, not less than 2 and not more than 4. For the exclusion criteria, I had recent hand injury, history of color blindness, history of maleness, and any learning and development and disorders. This was the sequence which I had followed for obtaining the sample from a test and the control group. It comprised of the SF36 questionnaire. So this is a standardized questionnaire which is used to select healthy subjects and to rule out any major illnesses. I also had a self-arrested structured questionnaire which I myself prepared to gather demographic data and also to check for the desirable gaming habits and then get them into the test and the control. There was a written informed consent which was also taken by the guardians of the minor adolescents, and finally the standardized IQ scale. This was done to ensure that I don't select overly intellectual and brilliant students or to take any pathologically retarded participants for the project. Now, this was the main project. For the 6 cognitive functions that I've chosen to study, we used 6 standardized tests which correspond to the 6 cognitive functions. We had the Corsi block tapping test, which tests visual scan speed. This was a computerized test and the data was collected as a score out of 10. For interference inhibition, we had a 2 test and the data was collected in seconds. Here, the participants had to read out the names of all the colors which are mentioned here and not the color in which the word itself is written. The letter substitution, tension, and cancellation, and the data was collected as scores out of 90. For executive functioning, I had the data was collected in, and finally for the short-term working memory, we had the digit span test, and the data was collected as a out of 10. Analysis was done using PET test, and according to the test, there was a positive association between playing video games and 5%, except actually the visual scan speed, for which we had the Corsi block tapping test. So attention span, alertness, interference inhibition, short-term working memory, and executive function all showed a positive correlation. And the female gamers showed the results with all the 6 cognitive functions as into their male counterparts, but the results were significantly higher with respect to attention span, alertness, executive functioning, and interference inhibition. Also, the strategy genre of video games showed positive correlation to the impact that video games have on the cognition of adolescents in comparison to aggression games. So after data analysis, I came to the conclusion that there is a effect of playing video games on 5 cognitive functions, which are executive functioning, short-term working memory, alertness, attention span, interference. There is no significant effect of playing video games on the visual scan speed. The effect of playing video games is significantly higher in the cognition of female game compared to male with respect to the attention span, alertness, executive functioning, and interference inhibition. And finally, that the strategy genre video games has a significant effect on their cognitive functions. These are some references for my project. This brings me to the end of my research project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meghna. I think considering the current generation, this is something we all need to know because we're so involved in video games and don't understand the effects of it on the human body. So I really hope your presentation gets published in the near future. Coming to our last question,
Thanks
the last presenter. I can see some questions. We'll be coming to the questions right at the end. So we have one more presenter for the evening, and that is Shashank Kranti Kiran, who's a final year student from SDM CMS Medical College in Karnataka. His research was ICMR approved in 2017 and published in the International Journal of Physiology and Pathology. And his research is basically the evaluation of sleep quality in shift workers and its effect on cognition using reaction time. So Shashank, are you ready?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Yeah. Could you share your screen?
Yeah, is it visible? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, a very good evening to one and all present in the Zoom call. Myself, Shashank K from SDM College of Medical Sciences and Hospital, Dharwad, Karnataka. I am very pleasured and honored to be presenting this in the MSCI conference. Thank you. My topic is evaluation of sleep quality in shift workers and its effects on cognition using reaction time. Introduction. Sleep is an important biological function. Restful sleep provides the basis for physical, mental, and psychological well-being in humans. Technological, economic, and social pressures have led to an increase in the number of shift workers. Cognition is a mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and senses. Reaction time is defined as the interval between presentation of stimulus and appearance of appropriate voluntary response in the subject. Reaction time has physiological significance and is a simple and non-invasive test of peripheral as well as central neural structures. Reaction time is related to cognitive functions in healthy subjects and patients. Thus, simple and choice reaction time tests could serve as bedside measurements reflecting cognitive functions. Exposure to shift work, especially to night shift, goes against the circadian rhythm of the social man, which brings about a multitude of disruptive effects on health, like sleep disturbance, decreased cognitive performance, fatigue, and increased risk of accidents. Nursing care is a holistic care that involves healing the mind, body, and soul of our patients. Aim of the study. Aim of my study is to evaluate the sleep quality and its association with cognition amongst hospital shift working nurses. Methodology. It's a cross-sectional study including 150 subjects. I have divided the subjects into 3 groups. That is, Group 1, which has 50 day shift nurses. Second group includes 50 night shift nurses. And third group includes women not exposed to shift work. In the inclusion criteria, female nurses were only included in Group A and B. In Group A, nurses who are doing night shift duty from past 1 week were included. In Group B, nurses who are doing day shift duty from past 1 week were included. In Group C, normal healthy female individuals were considered. Exclusion criteria: history of psychoactive substance use, pregnant females, women with any kind of metabolic disorder, women with history of consumption of CNS affecting drugs, women with history of color blindness. Moving on to parameters of the study. Firstly, informed consent. An informed consent was taken before conducting the study, which stated the methods and the instruments used in the study, and also stated that the information gained will be used only for study purpose. Quality of sleep. Pittsburgh Sleep Qualitative Index, PSQI, was used. It's a very popular questionnaire used to assess sleep quality. PSQI is a self-rated questionnaire comprising questions to assess 7 domains of sleep, including subjective sleep latency, sleep duration, habitual sleep efficiency, sleep disturbances, use of sleeping medication, and daytime dysfunction. Each domain is rated on a 4-point scale varying from 0 to 3, which generates a total score ranging between 0 and 21. In the questionnaire, 0 points indicated no problem, while 3 points indicated a serious problem. The scores of all 7 components were added to form one global score. Now, assessment of cognition. Cognitive function was assessed by using reaction time. Reaction time in milliseconds were measured by using reaction time apparatus. The visual and auditory stimulus was used to determine simple reaction time and choice reaction time. So this is the reaction time apparatus. On one side is operated by the researcher, that's the controller. The other side is operated by the subject. The subject is asked to keep her right hand on the right button and left thumb on the left button. 2 color displays are present in front of the subject. One is the red button, the other is the green light button. So when the subjects are asked to press the button, they're going to press the respective buttons. For the simple visual reaction time, it involves a stimulus in the form of red light, which glows in front of the subject. On perceiving the stimulus, the subject is asked to press the right button with the right finger. The time starts with the stimulus and stops when the button is pressed. The reaction time is displayed on the LED screen, measured in milliseconds, and is recorded. Okay, for the simple choice reaction time, the choice visual reaction time involves 2 stimulus, one red light and another green light. Either of the 2 lights glow randomly as controlled by the operator. On perceiving the green light, the subject is asked to press the left button, and on perceiving the red light, the subject is asked to press the right button. When the subject presses the button, the time is stopped and the time is recorded. Both simple and choice auditory and reaction time is done by giving beep tone and trim tone to the subject and is determined in the same way as the visual reaction time. Both these procedures were repeated for 3 times and 3 readings were displayed and noted. The least of the 3 were taken as subject's best auditory and visual reaction time and recorded in the subject's proforma. Statistical analysis. Inter and intergroup analysis was done using ANOVA and Takei's post hoc analysis using SPSS 20 software. Values are expressed as mean plus or minus standard deviation. P values less than 0.05 is considered as significant. Now, finally, moving on to the results. I have tabulated results in 2 tables. Table 1 shows quality of sleep and its various components assessed using Pittsburgh Sleep Qualitative Index questionnaire amongst the participants. So we can see all the 7 components of sleep given here. The sum total of the scores of all the 7 components of sleep makes the PSQI global score. We can clearly see that PSQI global score is way higher in night shift workers when compared to day shift workers and controls. Now moving on to table 2. Table 2 shows Cognition assessed using reaction time, that is simple and choice visual and auditory amongst the participants. Now this table shows simple visual reaction time and choice visual reaction time is way higher when compared to day shift and controls in the night shift workers. Choice visual reaction time minus simple visual reaction time, which is statistically very significant, also tells that the value is higher in night shift workers when compared to day shift workers and the controls. Similarly, while seeing the values of simple auditory and choice auditory reaction time, we see the values are slightly higher in night shift workers when compared to day shift workers and controls. Again, the difference between them, which is statistically significant, is also way higher compared in the night shift workers compared to day shift and control. Conclusion. Thus, I conclude that night shift nurses have poor quality of sleep when compared to day shift nurses and those who are never exposed to shift work. My study also concludes that poor quality of sleep has very strong association with reduced cognition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shashank. I think after all the knowledge we've gained from both the EB members and all the presenters today, I think that'll definitely inspire the rest of us to take up research and follow in their footsteps. A little bit I'd like to add is if any of you want the link to their research papers published, I think you can get in touch with us if you want to read up more about their research. And a little bit about the first presenter, Lavanya. So she received the Chancellor's Summer Research Fellowship UG 2020 award and won the Best Paper Award in Yukti 2019 in Chennai. So I think this is something that we could definitely learn from, considering she's just a second year student. And moving on to the questions, Suhani will be taking over. She is the National Assist for Development.
Okay, thank you so much, Anusha. So we have some questions that the presenters are going to answer right now. Some common questions were, is there any other platform than ICMR for starting a research?
Can I answer that question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so my research, as I told you, was I started way before ICMR even came into the picture. So if you're really interested in research, since there are types of researches where you can even do it without funds, like for example, if you're doing a retrospective study like mine, you don't need to spend much cash. So studies like that, you can start at any time you want. So you don't definitely need a platform like ICMR to start it off. And once you start off, there are many journals where you can get it published at a lower rate. But ICMRs and things like the Chancellor Fellowship my college awarded me, these give you an extra boost, and sometimes they even give you a grant, which helps develop your research topic better. But the answer to the question is you don't need to wait for a platform. You can start it anytime you want. Depends on your interest.
Thank you so much, Lavanya. That was really sweet of you to have answered that. We have another question coming up, that what's the typical time frame for undergraduate research and how much time should I realistically set myself to complete it?
Now, this is a completely subjective topic. Somebody who's studying in third year may have a lot of free time and may take, 3 months to finish it. And somebody who is maybe a final year student or an intern may take a lot of time. So sometime between 3 months to 1 year is a time frame for somebody to finish the research project and get it published.
Okay, there's this little question for you, Meghna, from Richa, that how did you come up with these tests to evaluate different cognitive abilities?
Yeah, see, these are standardized tests. So I had to read a lot of research paper and articles to check for, tests which have been used time and again to check these cognitive functions. So there were a lot of researches which isolatedly focused on not those 6 cognitive functions that I took altogether, but some focused on just alertness, some focused just on attention span. So I combined it. I came up with my own idea wherein I can take 6 cognitive functions together and do it. So these are standardized tests. You need to read a lot of research paper and articles to come uh, to decide on a research protocol and the methodology.
Okay, thank you so much. There's another question. How do you ensure that the cause effect relationship between your criteria you have chosen? Like, how do you make sure genetics and other factors such as mental trauma in the past or other factors do not have any effect on your results?
Well, yeah, I got this message on my WhatsApp as well, and I've answered that person personally. But yes, the personalized questionnaire that I had prepared aimed at weeding out people who have faced physical as well as mental disorders. And the SF36 questionnaire which I used is a standardized questionnaire which is used to again rule out major illnesses and developmental delays and disorders. So that does help a lot. The only factor which I found limiting was natural agility, natural speed, which some people have when it comes to typing or using a device, or some people who have a lot of agility, like I said. So that is something which I cannot normalize or equalize among all my participants. So yeah, but every has limitations and drawbacks. This would be mine.
Thank you so much, Meghna. I think Shiv can take over. Maybe these were the general questions that I got from most of the people.
Thank you, Suhani. And I also thank all the presenters for presenting such a beautiful research with all of us. I know that you have a lot of questions. I see the chat box, and I also know that there's no time for us to answer each and every question. So if you have any questions pertaining to this particular webinar, you can send it on this mail, either this query ID or the assist ID, and we make sure that we get back to you, and we'll make sure that the answers are coming from the speakers as well as the presenters, and all your doubts are clarified. So now I ask my colleague Jay to deliver the vote of thanks.
Okay, guys. So now, yeah, as we've came to the end of this session, thank you so much, guys, for being so patient with us. I know there were like a lot of technical issues. Plus, there's something going on. Some spam messages are going on the chat box as well. So thank you so much for bearing with us. And also now I have one important thing. Please do not leave your WhatsApp groups, guys. All the certificates would be sent to you on your WhatsApp groups. So as that's the only medium of coordination between us and Scori and you guys. So please do not leave your WhatsApp group. Now there are a lot of non-MSI members who are present right now along with us. So for them, what we can do is, as you guys attended the whole session and we know that you do deserve a certificate as well for this, so what you can do is you can actually basically register with the MSAI. The links to register in MSAI is right now on the screen, if you can see that on your screen. And we can also provide this link to you on all the WhatsApp groups, and you can register yourself. And if you get registered yourself by tomorrow, then we can guarantee you a certificate for this session. So kindly register yourself for MSAI. It's the largest student body. As medical students, I think you should be a part of this organization because it's the largest student organization for medical students in India. And it has, a lot of collaborations with WHO, with UN, with WFME, a lot of other organizations. And the parent body is IFMSA, which is again the largest student body for all the medical students throughout the world. So it's like connecting the medical students throughout the globe. So I guess you know how important it is, to be connected. And that's why kindly make sure that you register for MSAI. And that would be all. Thank you so much for being with us today. And we'll be waiting up for your doubts, any queries that you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay. And I thank all the participants, all the speakers, and all the presenters for being here, making some time. I thank all the Zoom attendees as well as the YouTube live stream attendees. And I know that you have a lot of questions. We'll try to get through them. And yeah, I'll be ending the webinar right now. As I said, I would like to just mention again that if you have any queries, you can mail it to these email IDs. I will be sharing it on the WhatsApp groups as well. And a post-event form will also be shared on all the WhatsApp groups. So please don't leave the WhatsApp groups. And yeah, which is very important for you to get your certificates. Yeah, I think I'll be ending the webinar now. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much.